morning in Europe. Also very good afternoon and maybe on some places of the world already early evening. Welcome in this session S2 on COVID-19, assessing the potential consumer risk and managing value chain disruption. My name is Marcel Swietering. I'm a professor of food microbiology at Wageningen University, and I will be the convener of this session. The chairman of the ICMSF, and this session is also organized by the ICMSF. And we have today three speakers. The first speaker is Leon Gorres, and he will tell about science update and a view on potential food safety risks. Then we have Wayne Anderson telling about food safety regulatory challenges for COVID-19 pandemic. And then we have John Donnelly navigating challenges of COVID-19 in the food processing chain. So the first speaker will be Leon Gorres, and he is a food safety expert at Food Safety Futures in the Netherlands. He has been working 2 years as freelancer now. Before he worked 21 years with Unilever. Before that he worked 8 years with governmental research, and also in his career he worked 6 years as university professor. And he is the secretary of the ICMSF, and he's also very active in IAFP. After Leon, there will be a presentation of Wayne Anderson, and he's working for the Food Safety Authority in Ireland, and he's their Director of Food Science and Standards. He has been working for 21 years at the Food Safety Authority of Ireland. Before that, he worked 10 years at Unilever Research. He's an ICMSF member, and he's also very active in the World Health Organization and Food and Agriculture Organization expert consultations in meetings and also in chairing these meetings. And the last speaker will be John Donnelly, and he's working with Nestlé, and he's head of safety, food safety, corporate quality in Switzerland. He has been with 10 years with Nestlé now, 3 years in R&D and 7 years in operations. And he has before that worked for 18 years at AGI, Food and Bioscience Institute in Ireland. He's also ICMSF member and active in ILSE Europe and Food Drink Europe. So I would now like to give the handover to Leon to give the first presentation.
Thank you very much, Marcel. So I will start the session today with a science update and a view on how risks pan out for COVID-19. And of course, maybe it's good then to start with some premises that I have built this talk on. First of all, the premise that COVID-19 is an illness caused by SARS-CoV-2, a coronavirus. These are viruses that are zoonotic viruses. They originate from animals, but we believe it is not a food safety issue. The coronavirus is not foodborne, causing COVID-19 or another foodborne illness. Rather, it's an occupational safety issue for company employees and for employers then to manage. And it's a general health issue, a health issue for the general public. The communities that people mingle in are at risk if people are contaminated and get in contact with others. And any operation, any business, any company that needs to manage the risks of COVID-19 illness on their workforce, and maybe if the workforce is implicated, is impacted then on business continuity. Businesses have to understand how SARS-CoV-2 might spread in their operations, how from their operations there's a link to communities, there's a link to general public that needs to be managed. Now thinking specifically about food companies and food business operations, next to those two areas where they have the same responsibility as any other company, they have to understand additionally what role food or the food system could play in spreading the illness. Is the illness spread through food at all? Or the other side of it, would our food systems like good hygienic practices and food safety management practices may help in mitigating the COVID-19 spread? And how does it spread? A simple picture to explain that there are three routes. The route through the middle, so to speak, an ill person might produce droplets of fluid by sneezing, coughing. Those droplets might expose a generally healthy person. Those droplets are quite big in volume, might contain quite some particles, virus particles, and when a other person is exposed directly through inhaling or via use of hands spreading over the face, there could be a contamination as a result. Next to droplets, aerosols are possibly implicated in direct person-to-person contamination. A ill person might be breathing out smaller volumes of droplets, aerosols, and another person might be breathing them in. The third route is where maybe a food route could be more relevant, an indirect route from person to surface to person. Droplets or aerosols could land on surfaces, and then somebody could touch the surface, could use fingers to spread the virus particles onto the face, or maybe even into the eyes, nose, and mouth, through which the virus particles then ingress into the body. And that last route is then where food safety concerns have been raised from early on, when the organism was detected and found to spread over the world. In particular, there was a lot of attention to the stability of the virus on surfaces in aerosols, the survival and also the transmission was investigated a lot. What was apparent is that there were a lot of studies looking at survival, and one after another study kind of was competing. How can we find the longest time for survival for this organism? And these publications have certainly been issued very often in pre-peer review papers that haven't been through peer review, as the name of course says, and they were picked up by media that hyped the story and put out warning papers emphasizing the survival of corona on different foods, often under chilled condition or frozen foods, and not only seafood, but also all kinds of other meats were implicated. And those media papers very much put attention also for consumers and for businesses on a possible food route and a possible food safety problem. Consumers responded in the sense that, as you see some examples here, they were quite concerned. There was advice on social media to wash fruits and vegetables with bleach to control the risk of illness. People were encouraged to disinfect packages, not considering, so to speak, the risk of the agents that they would be using for cleaning versus the risk of the transfer of COVID-19, the coronavirus, through these foods and food packaging materials. Because coronaviruses are enveloped viruses, in fact, washing with soap already has a very, very good effectivity. The advice for good personal hygiene is to wash regularly for 20 seconds or more, and simple kind of innovations that came up, like blue soap, help people to do it well, help people to see that they are covering their hands thoroughly, next to keeping an eye on time for cleaning. So all the major measures like bleach and others are really a kind of an overreach for this kind of organisms. Now, also governments have been responding, and in particular, there were concerns in China where traces of the organism were found on imported frozen food, on products, poultry products from Brazil, for instance, frozen foods on the Chinese market, ice cream contaminated with coronavirus, with using milk from Ukraine, and all these have in common that traces were found, meaning the RNA of the organism was found, indicating that the virus had been present, but having no reference to whether and how many infectious live particles might have been present in these products. Yet some governments, in particular the China government, saw this hazard evidence as the basis for blocking trade, holding shipments, or even destroying shipments. Now also governments have been very intensely sampling and testing and looking for live coronavirus, because that would indeed be more of a starting point for assessing risk of infectious nature. As one example, that was from October last year, I believe, where a shipment was sampled very intensely. 2.98 million samples were taken and 22 positive samples were found. Now, that is a very small positive sample out of that big shipment of product. Still, that was reason enough for the authority to call this a unsafe food shipment and take measures accordingly. Luckily, there were also publications coming out gradually that were highlighting that transmission and survival may have been very much exaggerated. And indeed, Professor Goldman of Rutgers University, for instance, was one of the first to point that out, showing that the survival situation, the transfer situations were often studied and reported on not really in real life situations, or not really mimicking real life situations so much. For instance, ignoring time and temperature impacts, ignoring the impact of relative humidities or UV light. And so it's very important to consider that in assessing the information, but also in then following later with assessing risk of these organisms. Likewise, an example of a publication from September last year, were in a hospital setting at a quarantine hotel under controlled conditions. The survival of particles was studied on surfaces, and there was no evidence found that there was significant survival under these more real conditions. Of course, one of the starting points for assessing risk is the number of particles, the dose of particles that would be involved in either of the transmission routes. And for instance, with aerosols, possibly small volumes are in play. So they could contain only smaller volumes of live particles. With droplets, the volumes could be bigger, the dose could be bigger. And contaminated surfaces, we don't really know if droplets would be in place on contaminated surface. Yes, there would be particles there that could be picked up. But then the question is how much time has passed between the surface being contaminated and particles being picked up. How many of those particles would have survived in that period, and how many are also transferred. And that is kind of the thinking of risk that we have to adopt here. So we have to understand whether we talk about live particles. We have to understand that these have to come into contact with the face or go into the respiratory tract by inhaling. The middle bit here would be picking up the live particles, transferring them to the face. If people use proper hygiene, regular soap washing, that would be a mitigation step, but there's also fractions being transferred. So it's not that everything deposited on the surface is going onto the hands, is then going onto the eyes, nose, and mouth. We're always talking about fractions, and in the examples we've showed before, we're not talking about the live particles. We are talking about the DNA, and then the question is: so how does that reflect the risk that you might have with viable infectious particles, especially if there are very few positive samples in shipments. The other question to ask yourself, of course, is also the mechanism of illness. And here's a picture just to compare inhaling and ingesting. Through inhaling viruses through the nose and the mouth, the viruses come into the respiratory tract, come into contact with the organs that they might infect, and that's very different from possibly contaminated foods. They would be ingested. The foods do not come into the respiratory tract, but they would come into the gastrointestinal tract and would end up in the stomach, where maybe gastric fluids would inactivate viruses. So a very different mechanism of action. Now also early on, WHO, FAO and other organizations started to publish authoritative food safety guidance, pointing out that it's very unlikely that COVID-19 can be contracted from food and food packaging because of that mechanistic thinking. COVID-19 is a respiratory illness, and that also evidence gathered so far, and this was 6 months into, let's say, the spread of the organism, that there was no evidence that there was any illness caused by food or through food and food packaging, let's say the transmission route. That is important information for food businesses, so they understand whether the food they're handling, their food operation, is a important contributor to illness. On the other hand, there's also guidance needed for competent authorities, of course, that was published. Again, that clearly also indicated that it is very unlikely that food is implicated in the transmission of COVID-19. Also, national governments have published good information, started early on, putting Q&As together, putting them on their website. And for instance, the Food Safety Authority of Ireland, and maybe Wayne will talk about that later, really took a very good and risk-based approach in thinking through the likelihood of food being implicated in illness and giving advice to the consumers, to food businesses, but also in cases developing qualitative risk assessments, for instance, on the consumption of bivalve musks, where they gathered information on this particular food and came to the conclusion that the consumption of these products comes with a very negligible risk. So very good information that can be looked at and can be peer reviewed. 2 months ago, the USDA, FDA governments also updated their guidance on COVID-19 as it relates to food and food packaging. And there, again, they reconfirmed what they did a year earlier, that there's no link with COVID-19 illness for food and food packaging. They, as one of the piece of evidence, they cite the issue paper, the opinion paper that ICMSF published September last year, and that follows, let's say, the logic that we have also put into the presentation now. So you have to think hazard versus risk. Having traces of RNA signals, there may have been viruses, there could be viruses, but it's not directly signaling a risk. The mechanism is important, inhaling versus ingestion. Ingestion comes with a very small chance of illness. There's no epidemiological evidence, despite already billions of meals having been consumed, billions of food items being handled. And if there would be a significant route through food, you would expect epidemiological evidence to be there. So all in all, it's highly unlikely that SARS-CoV-2 constitutes a food safety risk. And in fact, you can go through a list of factors that could contribute to risk. And you could ask yourself, what is the chance of this happening, an infected worker, and not being screened out? Now, there are very good procedures to check workers, employees, so to speak, at the gate, measuring temperature, doing fast tests. So what's the chance of somebody not being screened out, being an asymptomatic carrier, then depositing viable virus particles while they are adhering to strict personal hygiene, washing their hands regularly, mask wearing? Are there then enough viable virus particles that may survive if they would be deposited on surfaces? How many of those viable particles would be picked up and then transferred to the face in the area of the nose, the mouth, the eyes? Are there then sufficient viable particles to infect respiratory organs, other organs, and actually what is then the infection given the immune status of the individual. So you can break down all those facts and give them a chance if you would be able to estimate the chance. And calculating the overall chance will then be a multiplication of all those factors, giving you a relatively small chance. So it's not to say that there's no risk, there's zero risk, but it's a very, very small chance if you look through the logic. And if we think about the three routes of transfer, so droplets and aerosols are the major routes, and they're quite effectively mitigated by physical distancing, mouth, face mask wearing contributes, ventilation contributes in these routes. But first, surface transmission mostly really is also good, well mitigated through strict personal hygiene and behavior of people not touching the face. Those things should be emphasized also, not only for consumers, but also in operations. And to conclude then, so looking back a year and a half, we don't have seen any evidence of SARS-CoV-2 being a foodborne illness, COVID-19 being caused through food. The food professionals in industry and government, I think at the moment still get challenges on food safety every now and then. And it's good for them to know the facts, to be aware of perceptions, and maybe think through the risks of these of this kind of event happening, and how they can explain that to their customers and consumers. Ultimately, food businesses have a good history and already are very much working with good hygiene in their operations, with zoning and other measures that are also helping COVID-19 mitigation. But we have to be clear that food safety management is different from occupational safety management, and you're running systems, different systems that should be complementary and active, let's say effective in a complementary way. But it's also good to validate that they are not, let's say, in one way or the other, almost antagonistic. If you do one measure for occupational safety, that might not help to build a more robust food safety management system. So in that would be a conclusion so far with the science that we have. So no foodborne illness with a very, very, very low risk, if any, if there would be transfers that we have missed. Of course, we are looking continuously at new information coming. It's important that we keep an open mind on that. But so far, it's quite clear that the risk would be extremely low. Thank you for your attention, and maybe later on we can look at some questions you might have.
Okay. Thank you very much, Leon. There will be only one person that can, from which you can hear now the applause. Like Leon said, we take questions at the end. So at the end of the session, there will be questions at a little bit after the 12 o'clock. You can type the questions either in the chat or in the Q&A. There is already one question in, but I hope that the R value in this case is about 2. So because we have now one question and we get 2 and then we get 4 and then we have a nice number of questions, the R value can also be a little bit bigger. So please type your questions in the chat or in the Q&A. So now I would like to introduce Wayne to share his screen. And like mentioned before, Wayne is working at the Food Safety Authority in Ireland. Please, the floor is yours, Wayne.
Okay, I'll try and share my screen. Can you hear me okay, Marcel?
Yes.
Okay.
And we can see the screen sharing.
Okay.
It's not yet in presentation mode, but
no, I'm just going to put that in now. Okay, can you see the screen?
It's all fine. Yeah, please go ahead.
So, okay. Hello, everyone. My name's Wayne Anderson. I work for the Food Safety Authority of Ireland, as Marcel introduced me at the start. Hopefully in this presentation, what I'm going to do is just take you through some of the challenges that we faced as food safety regulators during 2020 of the COVID-19 pandemic. I can't really refer to it in the past since it's still continuing, but we'll look at 2020 in particular. And let's see if I can get this working. Okay, so just to let you know what the Food Safety Authority of Ireland is, we were the first independent state agency focused on food safety in Europe, and our legislation focuses on consumer protection and enforcement of the food law. So I'm not going to go into any great detail, but if you're interested in what we do and the kind of things that we get up to, you can have a look in the 2019 annual report, which is there on our website, and a lot of the information I'm going to refer to here is also on our website at www.fsai.ie. So let's move into COVID. We have an emerging risk brief, which is aimed at early identification of signals of risk in the food chain. And we monitor events in the news, we look at online postings, and we look at the published scientific articles to fulfill that brief. In the early days of COVID, around December 2019, we obviously were aware, like everyone else, I think, of what was happening in China and the very early reports that food might be a vehicle, because there was always the mention of the wet market problem in Wuhan. But it really seemed at that point to be an issue that might be limited to China. In the earlier problem with SARS a few years ago, we didn't really get an overspill of that into Ireland. I think we only had one case. So it was very difficult to see possibly where we might go with this, but we still were aware of it and we wanted to react correctly. We also rely quite heavily on the EU institutions, EFSA and ECDC, who look at the human reports of illness, and they carried out these threat assessments and published them, and this is a very early one from January that you can see on your screens there. And in that time, in early January, of course, it thought that the risk of a spread into Europe was low, but obviously we know that that didn't pan out to be the case as we went on. And you can see here also a very early email from Cormac, a person who looks after emerging risks and monitors emerging risks. And he was reacting to a reporting the New Scientists, which had gone through some of the issues, and he was alerting us, and me in particular, to some of the problems that were possibly a foodborne issue. So that was our very early system, but it wasn't really until the end of January when the tipping point came for the Food Safety Authority, where the ECDC report you can see here highlighted that there was an increasing risk of COVID-19 and urged all member states to strengthen capacity to deal with the outbreak. And that was around the 31st of January. So what we did, it prompted us to write frequently asked questions for food businesses to start to give them some location where they could get information easily on the virus. And at this time, it was obviously a novel coronavirus. It hadn't even been named SARS-CoV-2 at that time, and the illness called COVID-19. But we were trying to let people know and businesses know what the coronavirus was, what the symptoms were, could it be transmitted through food, what was the evidence so far, and more to point, what could businesses do? So covering the basics, what could you do? What hygiene measures would help to maintain the safety of the workers and of the food? And that was very important in those very early days to get the message across that really the basic food hygiene measures that we've been going on about for years could still help food businesses tackle SARS-CoV-2. When we published that frequently asked question around the 5th or 6th of February, we obviously started to see the rise in hits of that of the FAQ page, or the frequently asked page, and up around the 15th of February, a week or so afterwards, or 10 days afterwards, you saw the hits rise to about 2,000. So not a massive number, but obviously a bit of interest out there in understanding more about this. And you can see that that sort of dipped a little bit and ticked along as February went on. For us in the Food Safety Authority, we had an unusual focus on this particular one because we also had to make preparedness in the authority itself should COVID-19 take hold of the authority and its staff. And we had to make sure that we could ensure the continuity of official controls and the protections of consumers' health. So bearing that in mind, that the normal food safety problems of contaminants and bacteria were not going to go away, we wanted to make sure that we could keep continuity of service. So within a week or so, we had prepared a COVID-19 incident response plan outlining the priority services of the FSCI that we would need to keep running in the short term, and trying to address any gaps in our IT infrastructure to better facilitate any mass remote working that might come about. So, for example, most of our staff, or a lot of our staff, would have desktop computers in terms of laptop computers. So we had to make sure that those working in the priority areas were equipped with laptops and access to the file systems through the VPN. And all of this is things that probably we hadn't even thought about too much in the past. We didn't have a policy of remote working in the Food Safety Authority up until this time. The one thing we also did was to test that home working with our food incidents team to make sure that they could keep the European rapid alert system for food and feed running, and to coordinate any response to immediate threats to food safety. And then, funnily enough, while we were planning all that, we were just coming to the end of getting all that in place, and much earlier than we ever planned. The Minister closed all schools on the 12th of March 2020, and we instantly lost half our staff who had to stay at home with the children and couldn't come into the office, and had to work remotely as much as they could. And really within a week of that, Ireland was in the throes of its first lockdown, and everybody had been sent home from work. And it's kind of incredible to think that as we speak, I'm still working from home, having been into the office 3 times since March last year, and we probably won't even go back until the autumn. So it had bigger ramifications than we ever thought. There were also threats to the food supply, and I think that became very clear in the early days of COVID-19. Having secured FSCI and service in FSCI, and trying to deal with consumers and food business concerns that the epidemic was causing. So panic buying happened. I think it happened in pretty well all countries. Our particular panic buy was pasta for some obscure reason. But that created surges in demand in the food chain, leading to scarcity of certain commodities. And that scarcity itself fueled further panic and caused further panic buying. And supermarkets, as you can see from that point there, tried to introduce purchasing limits on people to stop that sort of panic buying going on. The also thing we had to do was to ensure that our food safety inspectors, the FSCI staff, were designated as essential workers within the definition of the legislation that had been passed to lock the country down. And that was essential because we had police on the streets checking for people moving around and turning them back home, and we needed to be able to move our staff around the country to maintain the service of official controls on food businesses. And that was very important to make sure we did that. The other thing that stretched us immensely were the many government meetings that we had to attend, and the demands for instant advice from government, which very often gave us very little turnaround time to come up with the information they wanted. And this problem in Ireland was magnified across the whole of the European Union, and there were threats to the food supply chain spreading across European borders. And it's funny because a trading bloc, the European Union, which is used to free movement of goods and people, suddenly found borders being closed and food stopped in transit. And you can see some of the reports there and the big lines of trucks stuck up borders. There was also mounting concern from farmers that later in the season, with the lockdowns and prevention of movement of workers, that the harvest of fresh produce would be impacted because of its reliance on migrant workers. And in fact, in some countries, that certainly panned out to be the case. I think Spain in particular found it very difficult to harvest produce in 2020. The Commission, though, in fairness to the Commission worked very hard to convince governments to relax those border restrictions and free up the movement of goods, and that really did help the situation. Probably that couldn't have been achieved without that trading bloc of the European countries and the strong cooperation that we're used to having between countries. So that was a positive, certainly, for that organisation. Back at the frequently asked questions on our website, we had to start providing advice to food businesses to address the problems caused by the disruption to the food chain. We had to focus on compliance with legislation, obviously, but focus on the securing food safety rather than the technical compliance of legislation. So it was very important that we made sure that food was maintained as safe, even if we had to relax our approach to things like origin labelling. We had to facilitate short-term changes in suppliers and substitution of ingredients, which were caused by the disruption to supply chains. Again, focusing very much on making sure that food was safe, so ensuring the businesses still maintained allergen labelling, even if they had to over-sticker labels. But we did have to relax some of the rules on origin and labelling. The food chain also became more vulnerable to food fraud and quality issues and safety issues because due diligence in suppliers wasn't possible at the time for food businesses. So that decrease made the chain more vulnerable. And we also had to ensure that our web pages linked to the advice on health and safety for food workers from other government agencies, because we don't deal with, as Leon called it, occupational safety. And that was important because we were still getting contacted by all of the consumers and food businesses about health and safety measures because they saw Food Safety Authority of Ireland as almost a one-stop shop. So we had to make sure that we had the latest advice available. Some of the consumers' concerns were raised by Leon. We had consumers contacting us. They were very worried about contamination of loose food in supermarkets and small shops. They were particularly worried about how they would handle food in home, how they could keep it safe. They've been told, obviously, to wash their own hands, use alcohol sanitizers, not to touch surfaces, and then they were there touching food. So it was an obvious reaction. But we really had to focus on trying to stop consumers from disinfecting food in the home. We thought that that posed a much greater risk to health than SARS-CoV-2. And we tried to link up with other organizations, like here you can see Safe Food. Safe Food is a food safety communications body that works across north and south of Ireland, and Safe Food were very good at getting the information out about not disinfecting food and how to handle it correctly, and that was picked up widely in the media, and thankfully that message got out, and the amount of concerns on that issue dropped away for us, which was really quite useful. So it's very important to link up with sister agencies in this context and work together and not contradict each other, and that's a very important thing to remember in crises like this. So coming back to our web traffic on our frequently asked questions, as you can see there throughout February in the top part of this graph, you know, the concern about COVID ticked along with around 2,000 to 3,000 queries on the web page each day as we updated the frequently asked questions. But really, it was when the lockdown happened in early March that we suddenly saw massive peaks in interest, and that peaked around the 20th of March, which was roughly around the lockdown peak start, and that was nearly 44,000 page views, which, if you compare it to the 2,000 we had at the very start, showed that people were suddenly getting very interested in this, maybe late to the party to some extent, but we're hoping that the 2,000 that we're looking at it in February were food businesses, and the peak was caused by consumer interest much later on, but you never know. The other thing I'm trying to show here, we manage an advice line And that advice line service allows consumers and businesses to contact us with specific questions. This is a major service that we tried to maintain throughout the pandemic, although we did have to suspend the telephone service because staff were working remotely from their homes, and we were able to take information through email, which was handy, and also social media. Here you can see at the top the pattern in hits to the advice line and queries to the advice line, and at the bottom you'll see the epidemic curve for Ireland, and they're very roughly kind of aligned, if you like. And what you can see is that the hits to our advice line, the calls for information, tended to peak just prior to the peaks in the epidemic. And so, you know, as lockdowns happened and people needed to know about how to look after themselves, how to look after their food businesses, and you can see those peaks reflected. And we've had 3 peaks now. We're just coming to the end of our 3rd peak, and it's interesting to see in that last peak there were far less hits to our advice line. I think people are starting to get the message at this point and not have to contact us. When you look at the queries, just some data here up to about the 19th of October in 2020, you'll see the top 5 reasons, and people were worried making complaints to us. They were worried about general COVID-19 advice. And then you can see the health and safety issues coming in, face masks and visors, but also the outdoor markets, how they would operate, how open food displays would be maintained safely. So very interesting queries through to our advice line, but yeah, we certainly had some traffic through, and that stretched us quite strongly, especially working from home. If we look at those complaints, the top category, just to see what kind of complaints we saw. For a start off, in the bar chart, you'll see that the actual number of complaints in 2020 decreased versus 19 and 18. I guess that's not entirely surprising, since businesses were shut, retail businesses and restaurants were shut for a good part of the year, and you can't really complain about a food business that's closed. But what we did see in the complaints is fairly stable types of sub-complaint. Unfit food, very similar from 2020 to 19. Hygiene standards, very similar. But interestingly, we saw a decrease in the suspect food poisonings reports, quite significant decrease. Hopefully that was due to the fact that people were being kept safe, but maybe it was more to the case of not reporting it. But the other side, other complaints, as you can see there, rose considerably, but most of that was fueled by the health and safety issues that people were raising with us. I've seen data from the UK, which shows quite a decrease in foodborne notifications of foodborne illness in 2020, and that's not surprising. I mean, trying to get to the doctors was very difficult during the lockdown, and most people tried to stay away. They didn't want to get COVID-19, so they stayed away and didn't report it. So I suspect underreporting increased significantly during 2020, which might affect the figures. So I think when you look at the figures for 2020 in terms of foodborne illness, you kind of have to be a bit skeptical about their comparability with earlier years. One of the big issues we had, and it reminded me of the REM album Out of Time, was the fact that we were constantly chasing our tails, and it was very hard to do risk assessments. There was a tsunami of information. If you looked at PubMed, searching between the 1st of January and the 31st of December of 2020, there were 90,000, 91,000 journal articles come back on that, and that's a huge amount to try and keep track of. La Chapelle in 2020 noted that 40% of English language articles about COVID-19 were preprints in that early days of the pandemic, not peer-reviewed at all. So the media picking up on those and magnifying those articles that weren't peer-reviewed made it very difficult for us having to respond to it. And for a small organisation like the FSCI, it was really quite impossible to keep up with the developments in science. So we really relied on our international connections to alert us to important papers, the WHO, ICMSF, other food agencies. And it's one thing about the pandemic and trying to do risk assessment, the uncertainty around the science was just huge, making the risk assessments particularly difficult. But it was very important to make sure that uncertainty was clear in any reports. And I think this report was referred to by Leon. We did a qualitative one on the consumption of bivalve mollusks in direct response to a government question about the risks. And we found that the risks were very low for this particular issue. And again, the uncertainty though was huge in this, and that's the difficulty. Trying to communicate to people that there isn't a risk when there's so much uncertainty is always very difficult. But I think what we tried to do with this report, and if you access it afterwards on our website, is you'll see that we're trying to be very overt about the uncertainty in the data and what it meant to the final risk assessment. Of course, COVID-19 not only disrupted the FSCI's operations, but also the official controls that were being carried out by other state agencies on our behalf. EU regulations require member states to conduct certain controls on food businesses in certain ways. So new EU legislation was needed to allow for that flexibility, otherwise we'd be breaking EU law. Fortunately, that came about, and you'll see it there on the slide. WHO guides and health and safety advice was used to provide the correct protective equipment for inspectors, and most inspections became remote, focusing on documentation due to government restrictions and advice on remote working. But nevertheless, we did maintain physical inspections where there were complaints or where there were food incidents and where public health was at risk. And we also suffered quite a few resource issues in the inspection agencies, particularly those under the health authority. Because inspectors, the environmental health officers that go out to the retail trade, a lot of those were redirected or redeployed into case tracing, human case tracing for the HSE to keep up with the COVID pandemic, and also in the laboratories that work for the HSE. Most of our laboratories for food are also linked to hospitals and have a clinical side, and many of those were redeployed into the clinical testing of COVID. And that decreased our ability to take food samples. So we're still collating the data on the impact of COVID on our official controls on inspections and on testing, and I suspect they will be down versus other years. So watching our 2020 annual report for those figures, they weren't available, unfortunately, to be able to bring them to you today. The other thing is also we rely upon very much is the self-checks that go on in food businesses and the checks and balances, and the disruption of official controls coupled with the disruptions to the normal checks and balances within the food business brings extra challenges. Business to business audits were not done, and certification audits were delayed, and then after that, they were done largely remotely. Our audit activities of our own inspectors, of the checks and balances we have on the work they do, were also put on hold. And the Commission stopped auditing things until later in the year when they came over to audit our country. And then they only did sort of documentary and virtual checks on us. So all of those checks and balances, which keeps food safe, were significantly disrupted. And that did raise issues at a time when food businesses were suffering because staff were becoming ill with COVID-19, and that put particular pressure on them in terms of training of staff and being able to maintain food safety within their businesses. Some of the challenges we faced included potential fraud, people operating illegal food businesses, unauthorized health claims. You can see here there was a coordinated work done across all member states on foods that were making claims to cure COVID and removing those from the market because that's illegal to make medicinal claims in Europe. Online selling blossomed, I think, as people moved to the internet to conduct everyday purchases, and what you can see is that we had big problems with restaurants moving from seated restaurants to takeaway that they may not have been used to doing, and also starting a very large business in delivery to home takeaway boxes where people would actually prepare at home as well. And all these new business models bring with them new safety risks, which businesses aren't familiar with, which is why I was surprised that the reports of food poisoning had gone down in 2020 versus other years, because I was expecting them to actually go up. There's also a paper I noticed that was published last week looking at the RASFF system. It's just there. And it concluded that the COVID-19 crisis had not caused a substantial change in the profile of European countries reporting into the RASFF, so there was no drop in that. They did notice, although, that maybe there were less border control reports and more normal reports out of the RASFF system, so maybe a change of emphasis. But it's good to see that by and large things didn't get disrupted completely. We found it a challenge to ensure food businesses kept a focus on food safety measures when they were so busy fighting COVID-19 in their food businesses and trying to keep their food businesses open as an essential service. There were also issues with closed businesses reopening and then wanting to advise on stock rotation, sanitation, water and staff training. Many of those issues we dealt with via the inspection service and the advice line and the additions to our FAQs, which was very important throughout the whole thing. People operating illegal food businesses was a particular problem for concern. Anecdotally, we had evidence of restaurant chefs on furlough, put out on furlough from their closed businesses, starting food preparation and delivery businesses from their own homes and from rented properties. And some people were just cashing in on the demands of home delivery and setting up illegal food businesses. The businesses were unregistered, which is illegal. They have to register these businesses, and they were often unhygienic in unhygienic premises with little or no food safety systems in place. So these headlines show just some of the more public issues that came to light. And we found that the number of unregistered businesses that we detected doubled in 2020. And you'll see there the headline there that talks about grubby gaffs, which is slang for unhygienic food premises in this context. And I'm going to show you one such grubby gaff now. And these pictures are from one publicised unregistered sushi business, believe it or not, operating from a bedroom in a rented house in Dublin. They produced and delivered sushi all over Dublin, North and South Dublin. And you can see from the pictures what the state of the facility was like. This type of practice presented real food safety risks, and we had to resort to online investigations or complaints to identify these businesses that shouldn't have been operating. And then even when we had found them, our inspections were even more complicated because we often required court orders and police presence to go into them because they were domestic premises, and we didn't have the right of entry in some respects. So makes things very complicated, but I think you'll agree that it was very important to focus on closing these sort of premises down. Meat plants were also a big issue.
Can you round off?
Sorry, yes?
Can you round off?
Yes, I'll round up. So meat issues were a big problem, and we had our own problems in meat plants and issued advice on how to control the COVID-19 in meat plants. So the big debate that Leon was talking about was whether food safety was an issue or was it health and safety. We took our advice very much from the WHO and the ICMSF, and we don't believe it's a food safety issue, and we haven't focused our efforts in this area at all. We look at the information from China on the outbreaks, and we've seen that there are some epidemiological reports, but we still don't think the evidence is strong. When you look at the data on testing, and 670,000 tests on the cold food chain and 22 samples that are positive, it's a very low prevalence. And really, we find it hard to justify the direction of our limited resources into testing for SARS-CoV-2 on food. And even if we did find RNA, again, the virulence of the virus is really the issue. So in final, what we need to look is some of the issues that we found. I think the important thing is that you need to listen to the concerns and respond clearly. So you need to have a way of people contacting you. You need to stay informed about some of the issues that are out there, and you have to be very trustworthy in what you say. Coordinate with other state agencies. Make sure that your message isn't mixed, and most of all, you need to be fast out of the blocks. In this, you need to get the information out there. My physics teacher always said that nature abhors a vacuum, and unfortunately there's plenty of people out there waiting to fill that vacuum with misinformation. So as an authority, you need to get out of the blocks quickly. And that brings me to the end of the presentation, Marcel. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Wayne. There's again only one person from which you can hear the applause. I have to report that the R value is exactly 1, so 1 additional question came in, so please keep on asking questions. Maybe, Wayne, you can stop sharing the screen, and then we can then move to the next presenter, and the next presenter is John Donaghy, like I already mentioned at the beginning. John works with Nestlé Vevey in Switzerland. Please, the floor is yours. You can share your screen.
Okay, thank you, Marcel. So Marcel, you're the only respondent. You can tell me if you can share, if you can see my screen.
I can see the screen. It's not yet. Yeah, it's on presentation mode also, so everything is fine. Yeah.
Okay, super. So thank you, Marcel, and thank you, Leon and Wayne, for the previous presentation, which really sets me up nicely. And today I would like to take you through some of the challenges that we'd had as a food manufacturer, albeit a large food manufacturer, but I think some of the challenges we had as a large manufacturer are also resonates with smaller manufacturers as well, and how we tried to navigate those through many different sort of elements. And I think really from the outset, and Wayne mentioned being fast out of the blocks, and I think really I issued my first note to global operations on the 8th of January last year around the this imminent COVID outbreak. So really, because we have factories operating in China, and this is where it originated to begin with. So yeah, speed is important when dealing with these sort of issues. But really, our emphasis from the very start was twofold, and that was the protection of the health and safety of our workers, and secondly, to ensure business continuity. And both of those presented large challenges for us. As you will know, the food chain or the food supply chain is very complex and has many different interdependencies. And all of these elements from, let's say, from farm to fork were impacted in some way or other, and some more so than others, by the COVID-19 pandemic. But really from the outset, and still you might say even currently, we had two big opposing challenges, I say. On one hand, we had a large increase in consumer demand, particularly for some types of products. So really people were stockpiling, remember, in their pantries, in their freezers, etc., because there was panic buying. So this meant the material was, as Wayne has said, the foodstuffs were going off the shelves faster than they could be restocked. And this put pressure on us as a manufacturer as well. On the other hand, the opposing pressure was the fact that many people would be forced to stay at home because either they were ill, they'd contracted COVID-19, or they're part of a contact tracing program, etc. So, and this impacted everywhere along the food chain, literally even from farmers, through to primary processors to other suppliers of ours. So you had these two opposing pressures, and on top of all of that, we had this what I call the license to operate, and this is where different countries and different jurisdictions, you had different approaches and different strategies with regards to dealing with the pandemic and dealing with contact tracing and dealing with mask wearing and dealing with all of the different preventative measures. So you had this to deal with from a large multinational food manufacturer like Nestlé. And I think, as what's been shown by Leon and by Wayne, you had what I call the infodemic on top of the pandemic. Wayne mentioned 91,000 articles in the space of 12 months on a topic that literally had nothing in January at January of the start of the year. So how are you supposed to deal with all of this information? Some of it validated, some food company. So I'd like to take you through some of the challenges we had in each of the different parts of the supply chain, and how we tried to deal with those. As Wayne has mentioned, one of the big problems that we faced was actually was supplies. We were short in a lot of different commodities that we needed to make our products, and in that case, this impacted how we designed our products. We already had packaging printed for certain products, and suddenly some of the ingredients that were in those products were not available. So we had to have this flexibility to change, and in a lot of cases, the regulatory environment allowed this change. Let's say where you had minor ingredients significant changes. But of course, the thing which there was no compromise on is your food safety. So if you had to change an ingredient in a product, you still had to make sure that it met the safety requirements, let's say with respect to allergens, microbiology, or chemical hazards. And Wayne also mentioned the fact that there was a shortage of some supplies meant that there was an opportunity for unscrupulous supplier to maybe indulge in some adulteration or sort of cutting one product with another product. So again, we had to reinforce our verification methods and our verification of our, either by analytical methods or through audit of our supplier, to make sure that we were not getting fraudulent material. And this was a little bit the same on the packaging side. Again, shortage of packaging on one hand, and what could you substitute? Which packaging type could you substitute for another packaging type and still maintain the same safety? And this is primarily is around migration of chemicals, etc. And then there was the whole issue around packaging itself, how you receive packaging in your factories or in your depots. We were, for example, sourcing materials that were packaged from what were hotspots or epicenters of COVID-19 at the time. Even workers had an anxiety around, can I handle this? How do I handle it? What do I have to do before handling it? A little bit what Wayne talked about in terms of fresh produce versus packaged goods. Should I be washing my packaging? Should I be disinfecting my packaging? How do you reassure people that the packaging did not represent a food safety risk? So we also had to deal with this sort of anxiety. And another aspect in relation to, let's say, transport logistics was in relation to containers. And I think all of you have probably seen recently in the news the story where the ship got actually stuck in the Suez Canal, and it showed you the fragility of the supply chains. For days, there was many other ships with lots of containers on board, shipping material maybe from different parts of the world to, for example, Europe or other parts of the world, and these were all held up. So the supply chain is pretty fragile. And something like, for example, where you have to use food grade containers for transport of materials, suddenly we were finding that some of these food grade containers were actually in a different part of the world from where they were needed to transport foods. So then you had to reassess, can you use an alternative transport containers? How do you ensure that they are still safe to transport food goods? What was in the containers beforehand? So this was another element which really came to the fore. Onboarding new suppliers, it links again to our supply chain. Typically, if we go for a new supplier, we will audit that supplier, and it'll be probably a physical visit to that supplier. We'll also do some testing, be it microbiological, chemical, allergen testing for the materials delivered for the first batches, or maybe for continuous batches. But suddenly we're having to onboard brand new suppliers without being able to visit them. So then this accelerated the use of remote auditing. So we were trying to audit many of our suppliers or our new suppliers through this remote mechanism. And of course, when what you lose in terms of verification through audit, you have to enhance through analytical verification. So we found ourselves actually having to do more testing on new raw materials coming in from new suppliers to enhance our verification processes. Cleaning and sanitation was another issue, and sometimes we forget all the issues we came through, but you remember at the very beginning when everyone started to enhance their cleaning and sanitation programs, and clearly then there was even a shortage of hand sanitizers in certain places, and even WHO issued a formula for preparing of your own hand sanitization. So again, we had to deal with that. But then we actually had lots of alternatives coming along about disinfection, sanitation, cleaning regimes that could be introduced to kill COVID in your processing environments. And this was very challenging because honestly, my mailbox was full on a weekly basis of someone trying to sell a new form of disinfection or a new form of sanitation or cleaning that would kill COVID. And a lot of the times this had no proper validation, had no efficacy data whatsoever, but yet there was, in certain parts of the world, factories were looking for what I call the comfort blanket. Maybe this will help on top of what we're doing in cleaning in normal circumstances. So we had to deal a lot with that. Even in supply chains, I think Wayne has mentioned it, Nestle, as you know, operates its own internal laboratory infrastructure. So our own laboratories do a lot of our food analytical testing, microbiological, allergen, sensory, chemical, etc. But again, a lot of the commodities that we use, for example, in these laboratories were being directed to other laboratories that were, suddenly PCR testing for COVID started up, lateral flow testing, etc. So simple things like gloves, like PPE, like PCR reagents, consumables. We were even seeing for a short period of time shortages in those materials simply because of the high demand in clinical laboratories. But then if I move to, let's say, our own manufacturing setting, and this is where we really had to adopt the sort of preventative measures, as Leon had talked about earlier, and this was re-enhancing our medical self-reporting, the stay-at-home policies, the visitor contact tracing, and this was important. It wasn't just our employees that we had to track, we also had to track many of the contractors that will come into our manufacturing facilities. It may be maintenance personnel, it could be pest contractors, etc. Even with those people, we had to make sure that that they were either tested, their temperature was monitored. We knew if they had any reports of illness that we were able to do contact tracing as well. And in some cases, then we resorted to doing analytical lateral flow testing of all employees, depending on the region and depending on the factory type. Again, a lot of enhanced hand and high contact surface points for sanitation had to be introduced. So we introduced new regimes or enhanced regimes for cleaning and disinfection, and all the personal hygiene and etiquette was reinforced. I will also talk just briefly about social distancing and some of the lessons we learned from that, and also from face mask wearing. But also I just highlight one point in relation to Nestle has a large R&D infrastructure, and so in addition to all of the preventative measures, we have, for example, some business that actually operate, for example, out-of-home coffee machines. So we worked a lot with a number of companies around, could we develop antiviral, anti-COVID surface coatings that would instantaneously inactivate COVID-2. And we have worked with a company called NanoView with their product called NanoShield. This will be published very shortly, but we actually show that this type of coating does really bring about a large log reduction of SARS-CoV-2 and other surrogates in terms of at first contact and in real life working in terms of even after washing. So this was some of the sort of additional activities that we're doing over and above. We always stress it's not a silver bullet to inactivate SARS-CoV-2, but it is an enhancement of many of the preventative measures that we were putting in place. When I talk about social distancing, I think this is the thing that we learned very early on. Social distancing is just not about in the plant staying 2 meters apart from each other within a processing plant. In many cases throughout the world, we have workers who maybe share dormitories, share local living accommodation together. They are transported together, to the factory. They log in at the factory gate or at the entry point all together. Then they have locker rooms together. They eat in a canteen together, as well as being at the operational level in the factory. So very early on, we realized, instead of having 2 buses, we may need 5 buses to transport our people to the factories, to ensure social distancing. At the point of clocking in, we had to, let's say, change the timings so that there was less people queuing up at entry points. And again, we had to reinforce social distancing. So this was very much before, some of the things that we take for granted almost now were put in place. So really the key is social distancing is not just about, where you're actually working, but it's also about where you live, how you transport to the factories, and how you enter, leave, and sort of mingle within the factory setting. Mask wearing was another issue, which again, I'll give you a little bit of a timeline here, because remember at the very, very beginning, we had the question, do we wear masks or not? And at one stage, WHO were saying that mask wearing did not have to take place. And there was a shortage of masks at the very beginning. So should we be wearing masks in our processing manufacturing facilities when there's a shortage of masks in the health sector? This was a very fundamental question. And in that case, then gradually enough masks became available. A lot of the supply chain increased very rapidly. And then we had to go for, well, what is the quality performance of that mask if I wear it? You know, and then a lot of standards and certifications went. Is it part of PPE? Is it a medical device? Even other organizations, for example, AFNOR came with specifications and performance criteria for masks in terms of breathability, filterability, wearability, cleanability, etc., etc. So we had to take these things into consideration as well. If you do wear a mask, that your mask is performant. And then, of course, you had to train people how to wear masks, when to use them, when to dispose of them. Should they use reusable masks? Should they use one-off masks? How often could they use them, etc.? And as well as that, we eventually got to the situation in some circumstances does wearing a mask in some circumstances represent an occupational risk? And we had to, again, do an assessment of that. If I'm in a hot, humid environment, you're wearing a mask, does that present a risk? If I'm in a cold room or a refrigeration room or a freezer room, how do I wear a mask in terms of if I have condensation there and I freezing of a mask? So even wearing of masks, we went through a long journey from should we or shouldn't we, right through to now we do, now we're wearing proper performance masks, but we still have to be aware of any occupational risk that might represent within our manufacturing facilities. The other thing which really came to the fore during the COVID and in food manufacturing was the use of what I call remote technology. The diagram on the left-hand side shows me at my laptop in an apartment in Switzerland, and I'm actually linked into our software called XM Reality, which really I am viewing someone walking around the plant, looking at a particular piece of equipment, me advising them where to take samples and where to look for as part of our environmental monitoring. And actually you see in the right side, very detailed looking at types of equipment. So this is what really has, I'd say, escalated or increased dramatically the use of this remote technology, even for technical support. As I often say, machines don't know there's a pandemic on and they break down. They have to be maintained, etc., etc. So often we have to give a lot of technical and remote support, either from a Nestle perspective or even from an external contractor's perspective. So we were using a lot of this remote technology now, and even more so probably in our auditing. And Wayne mentioned earlier about sort of a lapsing of audits and lapsing of certification because physical auditing was not possible. And of course, then we had to, all of our factories are FSSC 22,000 certified. Some of their certifications were coming to an end, last year. So how do we reassess them? We were going to, as I mentioned before, going to assess new suppliers. How do we do that, when we can't physically travel? So again, now we're seeing more and more move, I would say, towards a hybrid, just like this conference, perhaps. You see either a remote version or you see a hybrid where it's partial remote, partial physical. And that's even the nature of some of the audits that we have to do internally and with our suppliers. It's a combination of remote and a combination of physical. And the GFSI is heavily involved in trying to advise what is the best options here. Just briefly, some of the other things that we actually had to take care of during the pandemic last year as well. Onboarding of new people. This is extremely important from a food manufacturer's perspective. As I mentioned, food, some parts of food we couldn't sell quick enough, so we needed more resources. But in one factory, we onboarded 300 people, new people, in the space of 4 months to cope with the manufacturing capacity. How do you train those people in a short space of time while still being in the middle of a pandemic? So we appointed in factories, almost our COVID champion, or, so that was the person who was the interface between the factory personnel and also the local public health people. We also, in some cases, because we were producing a high capacity of food in some cases, we had even adjust our environmental monitoring programs. Sometimes we had longer production runs to cope with the demand for food. That meant, maybe the spaces between cleaning and startup or cleaning and production were different. So that impacted how we cleaned. It impacted how we did our environmental monitoring, how we did our analytical verification. Also, in some cases, there was shortage of chemicals that we routinely used for cleaning. So with complete validated cleaning process, for example, maybe for a chlorine-based chemical, suddenly there was a shortage of that chemical and you decide to switch to a new alternative. That means you have to think about revalidating your cleaning process, and also that new chemical may actually have chemical residues which have an MRL in some jurisdictions, in which case then you have to test, do I have residue of the new chemical that I've actually switched to from the previous one? These were some of the things which we had to deal with as well, and obviously deal with the higher risk environments where we have closed rooms, process rooms, where freezer rooms, cold rooms. Is there a higher risk of transmission? Is there a higher risk of people going in there wearing masks? We had to deal a lot with that. And then there was a question arose, as has been mentioned by Leon. You know, there is a lot of papers out there now that are looking at environmental monitoring, and COVID RNA residues being found on food. Does that constitute a need for environmental monitoring? You know, we have not introduced environmental monitoring for COVID-19 in our processing factories, you know, unless we have a specific demand by a government or a supplier, because I really don't believe that it brings a great deal of benefit, given all the preventative measures that we actually have in place and all the uncertainties around the result that you obtain and what you would do. So the very last part of the chain is, and I would say that I mentioned it previously, has impacted us. We saw a complete shift. You know, out of home, the circle on the bottom of this, the out of home almost business, you know, disappeared. People were not eating out in restaurants. People were not going for takeaways, etc., etc. But there was a dramatic increase. We saw about a 50% increase in our sales through e-commerce. That in itself, you know, meant that we had to switch product portfolios very quickly. We had to switch production from certain factories to other factories to cope with this new demand. We had to be actually a lot more vigilant around how we sell, how we report any defects, if there are any in products coming through e-commerce, compared to the normal routes where we would have normally gone through. You basically have e-commerce, you have bricks and mortar, or you have the sort of out-of-home eating. And so that change, let's say, in the supply channels did also, you know, have to be dealt with very quickly in terms of the types of products that we were selling and the types of SKUs that we had. Also, I mentioned at the very, very outset, remember the graph where I said there is the license to operate, which can impact you greatly. And just to give you a few examples, I think Wayne mentioned you know, a couple of them relating to Ireland and the UK. And for example, we had vulnerable workers must stay at home. Some countries introduced this rule. So we had situations, for example, where our quality team almost was reduced by 60–70% overnight, because if some of those people were diabetic, if some of them had undergone some cancer treatment, etc., you know, it was not, they were advised to stay at home. So suddenly resources were actually, you know, lost very, very quickly, just because of, let's say, local public health rules or guidance. Contact tracing was another one. Again, it varied across countries. What we had to do in China was very different compared to what we had to do in France or other parts of Europe, and also in relation to the US, for example. So again, we had to learn this. Some factories in some countries were considered non-essential. So we had almost the weird situation whereby we had a confectionery factory in one country, where the government said it's a non-essential factory, so it has to close. Yet we had in other countries, you know, so with surplus, let's say, personnel, and in other countries we were short of resources because we couldn't produce enough food, you know, to meet the demand in retail. So again, this was sort of let's say, the different licenses to operate. Even within some countries, we had restricted movement of goods, you know, between different parts of the country. For example, in India, we have our testing laboratory was in a different location compared to where our manufacturing footprint was. We could not take the samples from environmental monitoring or finished product testing to our laboratory, despite the fact that we're both in India and this normally happened, but because of the restrictions, we could not. So we had to immediately go for contingency measures to find other laboratories that could actually do our testing for us. And then Leon has mentioned earlier just about, let's say, China and the findings around the chilled and frozen food chain and the implications that had for trade, for example. Well, after the situation with the chilled and frozen chain in China, then just recently in February, in fact, China then moved to say that, there could be a risk to their personnel of handling goods coming from any country, and a country that could have a high risk of COVID. So literally overnight, I had to advise all of our factories who are exporting to China that we must disinfect the inside of the containers of the trucks that were going to China, and also to disinfect the tertiary packaging of those goods that were going to China. So we had literally overnight, we had to implement this sort of a regime and be able to issue disinfection certificates for the Chinese import authorities. So that is what has happened recently. But I think some of these examples shows you when you're a global manufacturer with multiple different jurisdictions and different approaches, and particularly with a moving target almost in terms of the information that was coming, that really had to adopt very, very quickly. So I'd like to end with that, and I think we talk a lot about the R word, and Marcel talks about the R word, and I think certainly in the food sector, the R word has been resilience. I think second only probably to health workers, I would say the food industry, was there and needed to be there at the time of the pandemic, and I think it delivered in terms of, it kept food on the table, as it were, for many of the people. So I think it has shown a big R in terms of resilience. So thank you very much, and Marcel, I'll hand you back to you.
Yes, thank you, John. And indeed, I was talking about another R word, which is, of course, the spread of the infection. And indeed, it worked nicely. We had one question, and then we got 3 questions, and then another 4. So the pandemic is going on. Maybe some questions still come in, but we have still 10 minutes to answer the questions. And I will first give some breathing to John. So the first question will go to Leon. And that's the question is on how do you think that the pandemic influenced the consumer response on novel food approaches? We have had, for instance, the mealworm approval of the EFSA. And please, we should answer short.
For sure, I will answer short. Thank you for that question, Lindsay. I'm not sure whether there was an impact. The novel food application has been successful. The panel, NDA panel, has approved this application on the basis of a risk-based evaluation. And I must say I wasn't aware of consumer responses linking this to anything associated to COVID-19. But if you like, we can discuss that offline if you have some more information on your side of where those consumer concerns were. Back to you, Marcel.
Okay, and then the next question is to Wayne. Were you involved in the redistribution of food due to the oversupply of restaurant closing to prevent food waste? And if yes, how could this then be safely handled?
Yeah, well, that's a long thing, so I won't go into it in great detail. But in our frequently asked questions, we handled the whole issue of food donation. So the question was, how can I ensure food donations are safe? Now, fortunately, we've been working with food charities for many years beforehand to set up quite detailed advice on how that would happen, and to also make sure that those charities knew how to handle food. So making sure the chill chain was maintained, allowing businesses to donate food that may be after its best before date, providing it looked okay. Not the case with use by date, making sure that they distributed use by dates correctly, and if they were freezing chilled food, to freeze it before the end of the use by date. So we have a lot of information there on how to handle it, but there was quite a lot of that going on in the very early lockdown, but not so much later on when the businesses actually kind of realized they weren't overstocking effectively. So that was a real issue in the very first part of it in March 2020.
And then next question to Wayne is, what was the biggest challenge you had at the start of the pandemic?
Keeping our staff working, to be honest. Not necessarily a food safety issue, but just be able to actually keep the services going, to be able to prioritize which services we needed to maintain in the short term when lockdown and working remotely. That was very, very difficult. And just sheer volume of questions coming in from businesses, from consumers, from government, and trying to handle all of that within the time scales that they were giving us, which were extremely short. So yeah, it was a very busy time, but yeah, we managed to adapt, thank goodness.
And then a last question to Wayne, but this question was also posed to John, so you can already, if you get back to your breed, John, already prepare for answering that question. So the question to Wayne was, elaborate on the management of the COVID-19 outbreaks in the meat plants in Ireland.
Yeah, well, every meat plant that had an outbreak was assigned to an outbreak control team, a multidisciplinary control team from the Public Health, Department of Agriculture, ourselves, a number of other agencies, the Health and Safety Authority. They went through every plant, instigating new measures that were necessary. And it became quite clear that whilst the plants had done a lot within the plants, they hadn't necessarily considered the issues to do with workers living in cramped conditions and workers travelling to and from work, and that had to be put in place. National facilities were opened up so that workers who were living in these sort of shared apartments and shared houses, if they did have to isolate, they could isolate in a state facility at no cost, as opposed to being isolated at home where they would infect their other workers. So yeah, a lot of stuff had to go in, and then the HSE issued that report on how to control COVID-19 in food plants. You know, testing the temperature of workers as they went in, questionnaires, all of that kind of stuff, and the social distancing. So a lot of measures, but still from time to time, there are outbreaks in meat plants which are handled on an individual basis.
Yeah, okay, so that question came in, but it also came in when John was presenting, and where we could see how he was showing the stream of people and of workers. So do you have any additions, John, to that question? What is your view on the outbreaks in meat processing facilities?
Yeah, no, I know there was a lot of concern raised at the time around meat processing facilities, but I think it's it's also, as Wayne has said, it's not just about the practices in the plants themselves. It's all the socio-economic issues around it as well, where the people live, how they travel, how they mix, how they socialise outside the plant. Yeah, of course, within the plant itself, there is some measures that have to be put in place, and certainly we were adopting as many preventative measures in terms of engineering controls, PPE, etc., as we could within the plant itself. And that was again based on our risk assessment. I saw many reports when they talked about meat processing plants, because there you had a lot of workers in close vicinity to each other. They were sharing tools. Because of the noise, they had to talk or speak or shout a lot louder. There was a cold environment, so there was even the let's say the plant itself had many predisposing factors that might help let's say maintain COVID if it was there, or to spread it among others. But we also have to think outside the socioeconomic aspects as well, outside of the plants as well, and how those people interact in the community. So yeah, I think a lot of industries are now learning to let's say to cope, and learning to know which preventative measures works best for their particular environments.
And then one question was posed, but then later on you explained it more in your expose about what approach and methods did you use for completing the remote audits, and if you use some new technology. But do you think that some of these things will remain after the COVID outbreak?
Yeah, I think one thing is probably the technology, Marcel, and then there is the processes. So for sure the technologies have advanced greatly. We use one called XM Reality, is just one of the platforms, but you've got the normal Teams and all of those things which you can almost do in a similar way, where you're actually sharing between one location and another location.
So from my side, John, that's freeze.
So and he's name them, but so they will have their own technology platforms that they use. But then there is the process. How do you do a remote audit? You know, and in some cases, if we were doing for a supplier, you may use the hybrid model whereby you do some sharing with the supplier through your technology, but also, for example, if you have a local contact in that area who can actually go and visit the supplier at the same time, then is a little bit of a hybrid. The person going is there to verify what we're seeing through the technology, and you actually then have someone on the ground who can sort of probe more on the questions. So I think it's that sort of getting that combination in terms of the technology and the process. You know, quite often we were asking people to share documents beforehand, and even certification bodies with our factories. So again, you put up front a lot of your documentation. The bodies that are doing the auditing review a lot of the documentation, come back with either the technology or questions and ask, let me see this, I want to see this based on the documents you shared. So I think going forward, you know, there'll be more of this.
Okay, good. I would like to thank again all the speakers and also the IAFP for organizing this session, and also, of course, the organizing committee for inviting us to have this symposium, and also all the people that asked the questions. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. So again, an applause from me for the speakers and for the audience and for the IAFP and the organizing committee. Okay, see you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcel.
Thank you, Marcel.